welcome tonight, everybody, or whatever time of day it is for you. Thanks for joining us for another session of the American Ethical Union Assembly. Tonight, we're going to hear from James Croft, who's already started talking with you. So it's kind of, in case you don't already know him, you can see him. And he is going to be talking about representing ethical culture in interfaith settings. And then a quick reminder with the Zoom. So we're going to mute everybody while James talks, but you can still chat and you'll have time to participate. It's very interactive. And you're welcome to have your video on or off. We do ask that you rename yourself so that we know who everyone is in the participant tab.
Great, thank you, Emily. I see that there is potentially a question from the person who's calling in. So I want to make sure to respond to that first. So what's the questions?
Thank you so much, James. I was hoping that you'll be reading the PowerPoint because I can't see it at all.
Yes,
that might help the other people that have trouble seeing the screen.
Yes, thank you for that question. Everything that we're going to discuss, I will read aloud and is in the file that I sent out and will be displayed on the screen. So everyone should be able to participate fully. Obviously, it'll be more difficult to think about some other pieces of text we're going to talk about if you can't see them, but it should be possible because I will be reading them out. Thank you for that question. That's a good one. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you. I'm James Croft. I'm the leader of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, and I'm just going to quickly make sure that my screen sharing is working the exact way I want it. So there we go. And today I'm going to be talking to you about representing ethical culture in interfaith settings. On March 9th of 1965, Martin Luther King led the second march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Part of the voting rights movement in Selma, the Selma to Montgomery marches were one of the turning points of the civil rights movement in the United States. This second march came at an intensely emotional moment, directly after Bloody Sunday. This is a photo of that, on which marchers had been ruthlessly beaten by state and local police with billy clubs and attacked with tear gas. King wanted the second march to have as much emotional resonance and political clout as possible. And so he explicitly made a call for clergy to join him. And hundreds of religious leaders from different faith traditions flew to Selma to join the march, making it an explicitly interfaith gathering. King decided to march despite a court order against it, telling the hundreds of clergy who had gathered at Brown's Chapel, "I would rather die on the highways of Alabama than make a butchery of my conscience." King led the group of marchers to the far side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, then stopped and asked them to kneel and pray. After prayers, they rose and retreated back across the bridge to Brown's Chapel, avoiding a violent confrontation with state troopers and skirting the issue of whether or not to obey the court order. 2 weeks later, after the final successful march to Montgomery, and after the brutal beating and death of James Reeb, who was a humanist Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston, King said these words: "There never was a moment in American history more honorable and more inspiring than the pilgrimage of clergymen and laymen of every race and faith pouring into Selma to face danger." That march was an interfaith march. It was born of an explicit call to clergy and lay people of different religions. It started in a church, and the turning point, the climax of the action, was a prayer. People down on their knees on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, praying together to end racial injustice in America. And I want to start by asking you a question today as I talk about the importance of ethical humanist presence in interfaith work and action. Would you have followed King's call and joined him on the march? Many humanists did. They swallowed whatever concerns they had about the word clergy that may have made them uncomfortable, about participating in a prayer, about hosting an action in a church, and they followed King. And I have no doubt that in following Martin Luther King to Selma and engaging in the prayer session which he led during the march, some of the humanists present felt uncomfortable. They had allowed themselves to be described as members of a faith, whether they would prefer to use that word for their own beliefs or not. They had to participate, at least to some degree, in a prayer service and in religious services at a church. And yet at the same time, a blow was struck for civil rights, which reverberated around the country. And I want to suggest today that sometimes to participate in interfaith activities like that, regardless of any reservations we might have about the role of ethical humanists in those spaces, is the right thing to do. Not always, not in every situation, but often getting involved in interfaith work is entirely consistent with the highest values of the ethical humanist movement, and it offers a unique opportunity for us to represent our tradition, to teach others about what we believe and what we don't believe, and show the world a different way of looking at ethics, a way that is often overlooked when the only representatives present at such events are from traditional religions. But what is interfaith work really? For some of us, it may conjure up a rather unappealing image, something like this coexist bumper sticker, which you see everywhere, which some people like, and I find it a little bit trite, right? Some people, it has kind of a simplistic, trite image, an idea of kind of sitting around a campfire, singing Kumbaya, accompanied by a guitar, or even better, a ukulele. And that's a common stereotype of interfaith work. Nice, unoffensive, not very effective, perhaps. But that's not what interfaith work has ever meant to me. To me, it's more about constructive dialogue between people of different religious views. And often it includes service work, political activism, and a whole host of other activities. And the purpose is the sharing of experiences and perspectives across lines of religious difference to build solidarity and to further understanding between people. And nothing could be more ethical culture than that, right? As the Interfaith Youth Corps, a leading interfaith organization in the United States, puts it, interfaith work is about respect for people's diverse religious and non-religious identities, mutually inspiring relationships between people of different backgrounds, and common action for the common good. And I think we can get behind all three of those aims. And in my role, first as the outreach director of the Ethical Society leader, the Ethical Society of St. Louis, and now as its leader, I've participated in countless interfaith activities representing the Ethical Society and ethical humanism more broadly. I've participated in interfaith services like this one at the Pride St. Louis Festival every year. I have participated in responses to crises in our community, like this recent press conference against anti-Semitism. You can tell it's more recent because I had hair in the first photo and I don't anymore. And political activism, like this prayer vigil in the street shortly after the murder of Mike Brown, a modern version in many ways of that march on Edmund Pettus Bridge. You can see me standing at the back, present, but not kneeling in the street to pray. Now, I personally began quite skeptical about the value of interfaith work and the participation of ethical humanists within it. After all, ethical humanism is very different from traditional religions. We don't assert a belief in God. We don't tend to pray. We don't look to a single scripture to ground our values. So I wondered, do we really have a role for this? And perhaps more importantly, do the other religious groups even want us to be present? And sometimes I've gotten the feeling that they don't really, that we are a little difficult to deal with. We're outside their normal range of experience. But I've found that working alongside people of faith and sharing our stories with them helps dispel prejudicial myths about humanists, because it's harder to disparage people with whom you've just gone on a protest march or got arrested with. And also that there's an inherent benefit in working towards common goals alongside people who are different to you. We develop our own understanding of people with different beliefs by acting in solidarity with them. Finally, I think there's a practical reason why we should engage in interfaith work, which is that if we want to make the sort of changes in society that ethical humanists believe need to be made, we need religious people. Many progressive social goals that we believe in will absolutely not be achieved anytime soon with just ethical humanists alone. There are too few of us. So we need the help of people who are members of traditional religions. And so we have to develop interfaith relationships and movements. And finally, I think interfaith work is a profound representation of at least one of our core values, often represented in the motto, deed before creed, the idea that our ethical behavior is more important than the metaphysical or religious beliefs that lead us to that behavior. And if we believe this, then of course we should be able to make common cause with people who share our ethics, even if they don't necessarily share our religious beliefs. Now, that's not to say that I haven't encountered challenges doing interfaith work. It has often been difficult. There's lots of challenges and complexities. And that's what I hope to dig into in this workshop. I want this workshop to help you navigate the complexities of engaging in interfaith work as an ethical humanist so that you can be the most effective representation of our tradition and our values as possible while you do so. And in order to explore some of these complexities and to get you thinking about them, I have put together 3 case studies. That's the text that's in the file that's in the chat for those of you who can see it, that are all drawn directly from my experiences of interfaith work in St. Louis. They are all real cases in the sense that all these things really happened, although I have tweaked some of the details for pedagogical reasons and for reasons of time, like I've cut down the length of the statements and I've slightly changed some details to get the point across a little bit. But basically, these are all real situations that happened. And what we're going to do today is look at these 3 case studies. I'll describe the situation and read it aloud for people who don't have the text in front of them. And then I'm just going to ask you a series of questions and we're going to discuss what you would do in these situations. And then afterwards, I'll try and draw it together by presenting some values or lessons that I've learned from engaging in interfaith work in this way. So before we start the first case, I think I'm going to give people an opportunity to ask any questions they might have about what we are about to do. And in order to, yeah, there we go. I need the participant window so I can see if anyone raises their Zoom hand or puts something in the chat, I can answer a question. Pull up the chat there. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so it doesn't seem like there's any burning questions before we dig into these 3 cases. So this should be super fun. Okay, case one I've called creation. And this, I think, is the simplest one. Now, in order to understand this case, you have to appreciate how the context in which this is happening. So I am on the cabinet of something called the Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis. The Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis is a nonprofit organization that attempts to engage different religious communities in the city and the surrounding area in interfaith dialogue and work. And part of the leadership of this group is what they call the cabinet, which has the most senior representative of many different religious traditions in the area sitting on that cabinet, and we get to make certain decisions. And I'm the representative for the Ethical Society and of humanism in general. There's representatives of the Muslim community, there's representatives of the Jewish community, there's many different types of Christian, there's Mormon representative, there's Buddhist representative, Sikh representative, so tons of different representatives of these different religions. And one of the main things that they do is they write statements about stuff that has happened either internationally or nationally or locally. And we get to vote on the statements. We get to vote, yes, we want to pass this statement. No, we don't want to pass this statement, or I abstain from this statement. And so I am going to read you a statement that was sent to the cabinet that I had to decide how to vote on. And I'm going to ask you some questions about what you think about it. The occasion of the statement was in response to the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the travel ban that the Trump administration had put in place against 6 majority Muslim nations. So many of you will remember there was a travel ban against 6 majority Muslim nations. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld the law. And this statement was drafted by the Interfaith Partnership to say that really that shouldn't happen and it's against our values. We should get rid of this law. And I want to read you the statement and then see what you think about it and see whether we should vote for it as a representative of ethical humanism. So here is the shortened version of the statement that was sent out. And it says this: representing 30 St. Louis faith communities, the Cabinet of Interfaith Partnership strongly condemns the Supreme Court's decision to restrict immigrants and visitors from 6 majority Muslim nations from entering the United States. This decision is an affront to everything that our faith traditions cherish. That, as human beings, we are all divinely created. That our sacred texts call upon us to be compassionate and just to one another. That our religious pathways are united in the centrality of care for the stranger and all who are vulnerable and at risk. We believe that there are not others in creation's design. We are one humanity. We call upon Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, in a bipartisan spirit, to work together towards national security policies that are strong and compassionate, to confront and to prudently move to constrain the president's power to act unilaterally on far-reaching immigration policy in our current climate. We call upon people of faith and goodwill across America to speak and act clearly and forcefully together, striving for a world grounded in love and justice. So those of you who can see the screen, you can see the statement on the screen. Those of you who have the file, you can read the statement in the file as well. So we're going to do a poll, and the poll is going to just ask 2 questions. I'll put the statement back up in a second. How would you vote? We're just actually going to ask one question. That one question: would you vote yes to pass the statement? Would you vote no? Or would you abstain? So I'll just put the statement back up. Yes, no, or abstain are your 3 options. Yes, there we go. There's the poll. So you can say what you think you would do in this circumstance. This is so great. I get to see all the results coming in. It's like watching an Olympics or something, all the little bars going up and down. Okay, so far we're up to 30. Yeah, we're getting there. So we've got 31 of 46 people who voted. I'll wait another 30 seconds or so everyone's had a minute to think about it and vote. Just 10 people haven't voted yet. So of course, we've got a couple of people on the call who can't vote, but we can still hear what you think about it in a second when we discuss it.
James, there's a question in the chat.
We'll talk about potential amendments. Yes, if in order to have an amendment, you'd have to vote no, and then you'd have to amend it after it fails. So if you're not happy with the statement as it stands, you have to vote no. You can't say yes and pass it and then amend it. You'd have to vote no and amend it. Okay, last 10 seconds to vote. If you haven't voted yet and you want to vote, cast your vote. Okay. So here are the results. So 21 people, or 57%, said yes, they would pass this statement. 7 people, or 19%, said no, they wouldn't. And 24%, or 9 people, said they would abstain. So most yes, and then abstain, and then no. Okay. So I would like to hear from folks about why they made the decision that they made. Why would you vote yes, no, or abstain? Let's start with yes. Someone who says yes, they want to vote through this statement. Why is that your decision? You can raise your Zoom hand, or if you don't know how to do that, I'm sure you can wave frantically and we'll try and find you. Don't be shy. I'm not going to judge your answer. Okay, Stan, go ahead.
It reflects what I felt all along regarding that situation. So I'm certainly going to vote yes.
Because it reflects what you felt about the immigration law itself?
Yes. I've always felt that we should welcome those who are less fortunate than us into our country without any doubt, as long as they're not criminals.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was a perfect example, Stan, of explaining why you made the decision you made. So that's excellent. Betty, go ahead, or Hank, whichever one of you wants to speak. You have to unmute yourself though, so I'll unmute you there. 1 second. You still have to accept the request to be unmuted. Then you'll be able to.
Okay.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay. I voted for it because this purpose is one that I could totally accept. And the only thing that's iffy is I'm not a great believer in creation's design, but I do believe that we're all in it together, and that's the important thing, the affirming that we are one humanity. And would be curious about, I mean, it seems to me many religions stop short of that. Even those who believe in creation's design, the Jews feeling that they're chosen people, and different Christian groups believing that they have the direct line to God. So I would think that others would have more difficulty with this than we would, because our emphasis is on what it means that we are together, function together, that we are
Great.
one to humanity.
Thank you, Betty. That was very clear.
If you others want to argue.
So that's good. So you pick up on maybe some of the text that you're not super comfortable with, but in general, seems like you want to go ahead with the statement. That's fantastic. So the next person, Chris, go ahead.
Yes, so pretty much along the same lines, that even though I'm not really happy or comfortable with references to divine creation or sacred texts, I think the overall good that's being done by this action and statement supersedes that in my comfort area, and thus I vote yes there.
Great. So some discomfort with some of the language specifically, but the overall sentiment is one that you can support. So you're going to go
That's
through.
right.
Okay, so we've got Amy, Essa, and then John and Martina, and then I'm going to call an end to yes people, because then we have to hear from no and some abstained people. So Amy, go ahead.
Okay, I voted yes, but with some caveats, really. I mean, my first question is really basic. Like, what is the point of these statements? What is the point of saying that we all agree on this? I mean, that's a really basic question. I've always wondered about that. It's like people who write petitions that go to the Supreme Court. I mean, the Supreme Court is not supposed to be reading petitions and deciding that way. So to whom is this intended, and what's the purpose? And then I guess, yeah, I mean, I'm not super comfortable with these references to sacred texts or creators and all that. I mean, yeah, I mean, I look at this statement as being mostly values-based and rationalize it by saying, okay, we're sharing the same values, but we kind of feel they come from different places. You know, our values come from different sources in our minds that people hear. They are based on science and reason and compassion. And then, you know, some other groups might feel they come from God, but we do share values. So they're my two questions.
Great, thank you. So that big question, why make these sorts of statements at all, is one that we fight about all the time in the Interfaith Partnership. What's the point of them? And that could be a much bigger strategic question for the organization, which as a member, we don't get to, I mean, as a member of the cabinet, we don't really have any say in that. They just, this is how the organization runs. So the question that we're focusing on here, I guess, is whether to pass this statement, given that they do it. But I do recognize that it may well be a bigger question as to whether they should do it at all, and who are they for? And that is something that we do occasionally raise. So I appreciate you raising it. Okay, Esther, go ahead.
I didn't get a chance to vote because it disappeared before I.
Yeah,
but
got to jump on that.
To me, I'm a little confused, because to me the issue would be, does the president have the power to do this? It's not really about the feel good, you know, we're all humans and God's creatures or whatever. It's I don't know on what legal basis the Supreme Court made that decision. So I agree with the appeal to the Congress people and maybe write to the president and you know, disagree with his decision. But I'm thinking that the Supreme Court might have ruled on whether the president has the legal right to restrict immigration, and I assume he does.
So that is a kind of question about, and that's one of the complexities of statements like this, is if they go into legal matters, like what is the actual matter of fact, right? So that is a question kind of outside the scope of which we can really address here in this workshop. We can really ask about, are we comfortable putting our names to it as a representative of ethical humanism, and why or why not? Okay, John and Martina, and then I'm going to move on to people who said no or who abstained.
Yes, this is John. I would have voted no, under the presumption that are we to the nose yet? I don't know.
That's okay. You can say why. Yeah, let's hear what you think.
I would assume that my society wouldn't have sent me to be on the cabinet of a group that was not accommodating and that would not be offended by someone asking them to edit this and to remove the divinely created and the sacred texts and creation's design could be easily eliminated from this statement without offending anyone. And so I think that most interfaith groups that we would be involved with are going to be somewhat understanding and accommodating.
And you feel like if they didn't make that change, you couldn't vote for the statement?
Well, that wasn't the question.
Now I'm asking you that question,
Now I'm not
John.
sure, James, whether I would or wouldn't at that point. But as I say, I think that most groups that ethical culture would be involved with, I would be surprised that they didn't make some of these changes. We even have to make that accommodation with the secular coalition as well, that we are non-religious, we're not anti-religious. So we accommodate, and I think we deal with organizations that are accommodating.
Okay, so as written, you are uncomfortable with it because it sounds like it has theological statements with which you don't agree and don't think represent
Yes,
the
they're
ethical
not
humanist tradition.
necessary for the statement.
Okay, great, thank you. Martina, what did you think?
I voted yes, because when it gets down to, we call upon Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, in a bipartisan spirit, to work together toward national security policies that are strong and compassionate, to confront and to prudently move to constrain the president's power to act unilaterally on far-reaching immigration policy. That's what made me vote yes, because this was just the beginning of what would have happened if he had been allowed to continue to do that. And he certainly attempted to do that throughout his presidency. So I felt this was a statement that made me say yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. That was very clearly expressed. So now I want to invite people who either said no or who abstained specifically to raise their hands and just give the reasons why they felt that way. So Deb, is that you? Oh, no, you put it. Okay, so Randy and then Norm.
Thanks, James. I'm kind of wavering toward no, although I voted abstain. I cannot support anything that grounds the justification for the statement in religious texts. There's a lot of nasty stuff in religious texts. And while this one, they're calling on some of the higher nice things that you can find in religious texts, I think that the statement should be based on human rights rather than religious particularism, and that I cannot support it, and I abstained because if they really want to push it forward, I do like that paragraph that was just cited by the person who supported it. But the rest of it, I feel I cannot support because it is too theological and too calling on religious texts, which are not a reliable source of human rights.
Okay, thank you, Randy. And I see that Emil has posted in the chat a reason for abstaining that's similar. Emil said, while the purpose is generally good, we as ethical culture practitioners can't endorse the notion that human beings are divinely created or belief in creation's design, right? Which echoes some of the things that Randy just said. So let's hear from Norm and then Dwight, and then we're going to move on to the second case. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Norm. There we go.
I pressed the wrong place. I was trying to get ahead of you, James.
Oh, were you, did you want to say something, Norm?
Yes, I did.
Go ahead.
Now I've lost the picture. Let me get that back. There we go. Okay, just you and I on this one. I originally chose yes because I agree with the underlying sentiments. And then when you said, well, this does not preclude amending it, I said, oh, okay, because the thing that, of course, struck out immediately was the divine creation part, naturally. I think that the presumption to wherever it's going to go, whoever's going to read this, that these are 30 interfaith St. Louis faith communities, presumably representing good people, people of goodwill, people who want to do the right thing. And that has its own foundation to it without bringing in the theological components. And also because I think we could appeal to the American tradition, which is e pluribus unum. out of many. One, we are a nation of immigrants. We are a very diverse nation, and why not call upon that? That as Americans, we believe that people of all faiths and all nationalities are similarly entitled to fair treatment.
Okay.
And then also we believe that there are not others. That according to American tradition, there are not others. That American tradition also includes excluding groups that just came off the boat, doesn't it? But let's be a little bit generous here. But I also object to calling upon Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. Well, I'll tell you something. I just leave the parties out, especially these days. But I think it's unnecessary to say that. We call upon Congress, period. Because if Democrats and Republicans do not, there are a couple of independents, at least in the Senate. I'm not so sure about the House of Representatives. So I'd like to just leave that part of it out.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Norm. I think that it's clear that you think that we could ground this in a sort of secular values basis drawn from a reading of American tradition and history rather than the religious spaces that it goes to. Okay, finally,
American ideals, James. Yeah, American ideals. Maybe
yes,
ideals are sometimes better than our history.
Right. And so finally on this one, Dwight, and then I will tell you how I voted and give you a little bit of a reason why, but then we'll go on to the second one and then we'll talk a bit more broadly. Okay,
so,
Dwight, go ahead.
James, a quick question. Were the people who drafted this aware that someone from Ethical Culture St. Louis was in the mix?
Absolutely. We've had a representative on the cabinet for many years, if not decades.
So I don't know if there's a better term for this or if I'm coining it tonight, but to me it smacks of theistic supremacy. There's absolutely no reason for the first of the 3 points. It's really just a thumb in the eye of anyone who's a humanist. So it's a way of I'm sure that these are all, good, nice people who didn't intend harm, but it is by definition a way of putting the thumb in the eye of anybody who's a humanist. So that's the starting point of why I would vote no. And I would also probably try to bring it to their attention without losing my cool.
How successful do you think you'd be?
Oh, James. I don't know.
Okay. I really appreciate everyone's thoughts on this one. The reason I started with this one is because it's a really nice illustration of a dynamic that I found often happens when humanists participate in interfaith spaces, which is that for a very long time, the assumption has been that everybody participating in such spaces agrees with certain basic theological premises. And our participation really problematizes that because we don't tend to agree with those basic theological premises, at least on an institutional level. And many interfaith organizations and spaces don't really know how to deal with that. And so part of our role, I think, is to teach them how to deal with that. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to vote no on this statement. It was the first statement I ever voted no on. And I'll tell you exactly why. I completely agree with everyone who says that politically, I think the statement is unimpeachable, although I think it could have been a lot stronger, actually. But religiously, it commits me and my community to something we do not affirm. It explicitly says that our faith traditions cherish the idea that human beings are divinely created. That is false in the case of my faith tradition. So signing it would make me a liar. It says explicitly that our faith traditions call upon sacred texts and that we find in those a injunction to be compassionate and just. That is false in the case of my tradition. And then the reference to creation's design, we don't teach in our ethical society that people are created or that there's a design behind creation. We have a whole evolution exhibit that teaches basically the opposite. As I said to them when we discussed this, we teach that people evolved from goop, not that people were created, that there's any design. And as an equal participant in interfaith space, we deserve as much as anybody else to have our views respected in the statements that are made collectively to which we're being asked to sign. We do not have to put our beliefs second. We are just as entitled to representation as everybody else. And there, as many people have said, countless ways that you can frame an interfaith statement that do not explicitly commit members of the interfaith group to things that we do not believe in. Now, I'll tell you what happened. I voted no on this statement in the sure knowledge that it would pass because everyone else was going to vote yes. But actually, two of the conservative representatives who didn't like the political implications of it abstained, and it failed, because if 3 people don't vote for it, a statement fails. And that put me in a very difficult position with the Muslim representatives who wanted to know why I had voted no. But it was a very good opportunity to explain what I've just explained to you, which is, I think I agree with Dwight, it is a form of religious violence to expect people to affirm explicitly theological beliefs they do not hold as a condition of participation in interfaith space. So that's why I voted no. I could not lie and say that our community believes something that we do not believe. I see that Amy had a question. Do you want to ask your question? You kind of put your hand up and then put it down, but I'm really good at this, so I noticed. You don't have to ask a question. Okay, hearing no question, we'll have tons of opportunity to discuss all this because I'm going to move through the next 2 a little quicker. I want to kind of get us stuck in. Okay, second one, similar situation. This one's called Pulse. And this was a statement that was offered for ratification after the Pulse shooting in 2016. That was the shooting of 49 people, mainly Latinx gay men, at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. And this is the statement that was well, I won't say it was passed. It was sent to us to be potentially passed. And I want you to think about, again, whether you would vote yes, no, or abstain. So here is the statement. As our society faces the massive and violent assault on human life in Orlando on Sunday, the Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis mourns for those who were killed in the attack, those who were injured, and all their family and friends. At this time, we offer our condolences and prayers for the wider community of Orlando and for our country, once again confronted by the face of hatred expressed through gun violence. We refuse to be silent bystanders who accept terrorism as the status quo. Instead, we urge all persons to condemn the dangers of extremism. At this challenging time, we urge our community to stand vigilant against Islamophobia. The reasons behind the shooter's actions are still unclear, but even if they do have a purported religious motivation, individual acts of religious extremism do not represent the beliefs or values of every member of that religion. The Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis stands in solidarity with the Muslim community and reaffirms their position as a valued and respected part of the St. Louis community. As a community of many faiths and none, we continue to pray and will continue to work for the day when all people can live in peace and safety. So, okay, we're going to relaunch the poll, and I'll give you some time to reread that and think about that one. And you can say yes, no, or abstain on this one. And then we'll have some brief responses in the same vein. This is so fun. I love doing polls. I love watching the answers come in. I don't think that everyone else can see them, but I see real time as people vote how the things are kind of playing out. And I think it's really fun. Okay, half of you have voted now, so 50%. This is also in the packet. So if you have access to the packet, you can read it, and it's also on the screen, so you can read it again and think about it. I'll give you another minute to think so people have enough time. Obviously, in these cases, usually I have about an hour to think, but it isn't usually very long. Usually they need a very quick response to these crisis responses. We usually try and get them out very quickly. So quite often we are making very quick judgments. Okay, we're approaching the same number of people who voted last time, so I'm going to close the poll soon. So if you haven't got to do it yet, you can vote the way you want. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. No one can complain if they didn't get a chance to do it, unless, of course, you're on the phone, in which case I apologize. But you can say in the chat if you like what you, oh, I don't think you can even do that. But we can hear from you what you would have said to this one. Okay. So once again, most of you would have voted yes on this statement. 67% or 22 of you yes, 8 or 24% no, and 3 or 9% abstain. Let's start with the no people this time. Why would you have voted no? Or the abstention people as well? I see Randy. Let's take Emily because Randy spoke just before. Okay, Emily, go ahead.
So I didn't technically get to vote because of being the host on here, but I was thinking no, and it was I get why people did yes. I was feeling yes until I reflected and went, they're standing by the Muslim community, not the LGBTQ community. They said they were against the violence in the beginning, but they kind of then focused on the religious aspect and didn't really mention the homophobia in the end.
Okay, thank you, Emily. It's very clear. Carolyn, what do you think?
Emily stated it well. I have voted to abstain because I'm getting more and more torn by these dilemmas that you're presenting me with.
Oh, good.
In this case, I can live with prayer. Some people pray. It's okay. It's not our job to tell them not to pray. I like the fact that the statement makes a stand about Islamophobia, that we don't immediately start jumping into that issue. But they never said that the people who died were gay, that it was a gay bar. They never said that this was a hate crime directed toward that community. And this event is one that woke me up more than anything in latter years, that suddenly we need to be taking these stands. And I abstained because I'm not yet ready to say just an absolute no to the whole statement. I can't push back that hard, but I really would like to talk to them some more about what they're thinking, that this is all they could come up with.
Okay, thank you.
What was the thing the voting on?
Jacob, if you can see the text on the screen, can you
Yeah, I
see
read
that?
it.
So just whether you would pass the statement, whether you would not pass the statement, or whether you abstain. And
Pass the statement? What do you mean pass the statement?
Jacob, I'm afraid I can't go back to the beginning of the workshop and fill you in. You'll have to just kind of catch up on your own time. So
do I agree with the conclusion? Is that what you're asking? To stand in solidarity with the Muslim community?
I can't go back to the beginning of the workshop if you missed the framing and give it all again. I just need to respect the time of the people who are here.
It's complicated?
It's not that complicated, but I think if you watch the recording, it will be clear. So is it Hina?
Yes.
Perfect. Go ahead.
So I also wanted to know, so I don't know if we're moving on to the yeses, but the reasons were similar to what everyone else said, where I thought that we didn't address the victims at all in this statement and kind of just talked about Islamophobia, which was okay to address. And I also don't know if it's just me, but reading this statement at first, it kind of felt odd the way it was mentioned, even though we were talking about Islamophobia. It almost felt like even people who didn't go there were almost like forced to go there by reading this statement, right? Like, I don't know if that would have, it just jumped out so much. There was a whole paragraph on Islamophobia instead of talking about homophobia at all. And it might have made sense to mention it, but the way it was mentioned, again, maybe it's just my reading of it, made me almost feel like forcing people to think in that direction, even though we were kind of talking about not being Islamophobic. But I felt like it would almost force certain people to think of it that way, even if they weren't, rather than just talk about, the fact that it was a hate crime. And anyway, that was my reading of it.
Thank you. That's it adds an additional element to it. Is that an unusual focus on this particular element might bring it to the surface even more than it otherwise would have been. Okay, I've made you wait long enough, Randy, and then we'll have Paul, and then we'll hear from some yeses.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I mean, this is homophobic hate crime, and they tiptoe around it in the first paragraph so artfully that I wonder if they could take a stand against homophobia. And therefore, I can't support this because it misses the victims. And while I think maybe having the statement about Islamophobia as, an aside on a greater statement that condemns Islamophobia and violence against LGBTQ people, this really misses the point. So I would strongly oppose the statement because of that, like other people have said.
Okay, thanks, Randy. And now Paul, and then we'll move to yeses.
Thank you, James. I agree with everyone who's stated the fact that it seems to miss the entire victims of the shooting and centers specifically on the Islamophobia, which is an important issue to address. But in addition to that, the statement doesn't seem like it does anything other than to ask us to pray. And I would like to have seen, a specific kind of action to take against what was going on in terms of the shooting and the violence that was going on.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. Norm, I see your hand, but unless you want to talk about being a yes vote, I'm going to move on just in the interest of time. Who wants to talk about voting yes? Because most of you did. So what was the reasoning for that? No one wants to say anything. You've all been convinced. Okay, Dwight, go ahead. You have to unmute. I'm sorry. Let me ask you to unmute. There we go.
Gosh, I love that other people caught the point that it's a totally homophobic statement and that it doesn't mention the Pulse victims. And I'm a Gays Against Guns volunteer, so I should have caught that. But I was able to vote yes for this because I felt like I could thread my way through it in a way that, like, okay, I don't agree with that, but here's the part that I can accept. And at the end of the day, I have to live with these people, so I go along with it. That's all.
That's a very important consideration. I think we always have to think about the consequences of our decisions in these spaces based in terms of our relationships with the other people around the table. And, as I mentioned with the last statement, voting no on that statement put me in a difficult position vis-a-vis some of the other representatives around the table that I had to explain that vote to them. So it's a perfectly reasonable consideration. Alan, go ahead, and then I'll go to Norm, and then we'll go to number 3. I'm going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
I can. Oh, except that it's very echoey. You want to try that again? There seems to be an echo on your end, Alan, of maybe it sounds like you. Yeah, that's perfect. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, it is questionable whether, just a minute.
Oh, it is still giving us a bunch of echoingness. Maybe type your thought in the chat and I'll read it to everyone, Alan. Is that okay? Norm, go ahead while Alan is typing or fixing out his audio issues.
Oh, I object to the exclusion of the LGBTQ community, the Latinx community, and the fact that it singles out just Muslims. So either it should mention all of those groups that the media have identified as those who usually go to that club, or it should not say anything. Just standing alone at that time, it was one of the larger, one of the most significant losses of life in a shooting.
Yes.
On that stand alone, as those who are against gun violence, it deserves to be amended better. And I do fully object to the last sentence, though, because it's inconsistent. Many faiths and none, we continue to pray. Well, those nuns of us don't pray, and therefore it's not correct.
Okay, great. Thanks, Norm. Alan, it seems like you're back with us, so go
I'm
ahead.
back with you. I'm back with you. You can hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, it is questionable whether the shooter was motivated by anti-gay sentiments. It's a very confused situation, and they clearly didn't know what was happening at the time. The shooter was of Muslim origin, and what they were concerned about was violence against Muslims because a Muslim man shot some people. So that is right on point. They didn't want to stop anti-gay violence. They wanted to stop anti-Muslim violence for fear that there'd be retribution toward Muslims after a Muslim man shot some people.
Great. Thank you for articulating that concern. I know that that certainly was on the top of their minds, and the question is still open. I even did a kind of bunch of research before I used this case as to whether the motive of the crime was homophobic. There's still a lot of uncertainty about that, it seems, although the victims certainly were overwhelmingly members of the LGBTQ community and the Latinx community. So I didn't just vote no on this one. I absolutely became apoplectic with rage, and I made it incredibly clear that they would not pass such a statement, or I would absolutely destroy them in the media in every way I could. You cannot vote yes on a statement like this. You cannot put out a statement against about a form of violence against a minority group that does not name the group that was targeted, even if the motives of the shooter were not to target that group. Those are the people who died. And it is incredibly unethical for them to not make that statement. Emil notes in the chat that he suspects that maybe conservative congregations represented wouldn't support an LGBTQ affirming statement. And that turned out to be absolutely true. They were not willing to pass a statement that named the LGBTQ community as victims of this crime. But that doesn't mean I need to put my name to their crappy non-statement. And that's something that I really encourage you to think about. When you are representing us and our tradition, it's more than just, you're not going along to get along. You're representing a set of values and principles that are supposed to make a difference in the world. And you can't allow those principles to be traduced just so that you can say yes to a terrible, terrible, unethical statement like this one. So this one is just not possible. The first one, maybe. This one was completely outrageous, and it led to some really difficult conversations between some people.
Which principles are you talking about? Whose
I'm
principles?
sorry, Jacob. I don't
Principles
understand
are you
your
talking
question.
about?
I don't understand your question.
I don't know. You're talking like somebody's principles. Whose principles?
The principles of the ethical culture movement.
Oh, you're the head of it?
Jacob, I'm sorry, I'm not going to engage in discussion with you. If you weren't here at the beginning to hear the setup and you don't know what workshop you're in, I'm not going to waste other people's time with the questions. So we've got one more to go, which is, I'm not sure whether I'm going to do this one actually, given how much
You're being
time
very loving and friendly.
Yeah, you're wasting people's time. If you want to.
No, I'm not. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the third case study, I'm not sure whether we're going to do a full thing about this. I'm trying to think as to whether we have enough time to look at this one. I think I'll go back to it at the end if I have enough time, but I want to give time for people to, for me to express the things that I've learned on the basis of this work and then have people ask questions, because I want to make sure that we don't lose time for that. So these are my 3 commandments of interfaith work that I've come up with from the work that I have done, right? The first is values first. What I mean by that is we should never engage in interfaith work towards a goal that conflicts with ethical humanist values. So an interfaith event that's against marriage equality or something like that, as a non-starter, you just don't engage in interfaith work for the sake of it. It has to be on the basis of something that follows our values or promotes our values. The second one is equal representation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. But what I mean basically is that we should have an equal place at the table with every other representative of a religious tradition. And third is right to critique. We should be allowed to critique religious beliefs and practices that we disagree with or we think are wrong, and that our freedom to do so shouldn't be constrained by our engagement with the interfaith work. So first, values first, right? We should never put our name to a statement or engage in some sort of activity that would undermine the basic values of ethical culture. Things like the equal dignity and worth of every person, the freedom of individuals to choose their own beliefs. And in a situation like that second statement, I felt very strongly that signing my name to that statement would undermine the values of ethical culture, because it completely missed this violence targeted a marginalized community, and it effectively erased that community from existence in their response. As a member of that community, I'm not going to go along with that. And so we need to be strong enough to stand up when our values are traduced in that way and say, no, not in our name. You can go ahead with that if you want, but we're not going to be part of it. That's the kind of backstop that prevents us from doing things that are not in line with our values. The second one is a little bit more difficult to navigate, and that's equal representation. I think that we should be able to participate in interfaith work on the same basis as everybody else, right? So we should be able to express our views just as openly as everybody else expresses theirs. So for instance, if they're going to begin with a prayer at the beginning of their meetings, then at some point we have to be able to begin with our humanist invocation. And if we're not being allowed an opportunity to do that, we're not getting equal representation. And I kind of split this one down into a number of principles, because I think this is one of the hardest ones to navigate sometimes. The first one is what I call giving voice. We should negotiate fair representation in any materials that accompany an event. Like, we should get our logo in it if other people's logos are in it. If there are a list of traditions involved, we should have our name on the list. Any of the language that's used to describe the event or describe the values of the interfaith community should be inclusive. So they shouldn't really imply that everybody prays or everybody believes in God, or even really just imply that everybody has a faith tradition. There are plenty of templates out there for language that's more inclusive than that, and interfaith spaces should be able to learn that language. It's just another form of inclusivity that all sorts of organizations have had to learn in order to become more diverse in all sorts of settings. And they can learn this new language, even if it's difficult. I see your question, Amy, and I'll get to that at the end. I think it's a good question. That's why I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. Secondly, we should negotiate opportunities for us to present our own perspective to whatever constituencies are involved in interfaith events. Very often I see us relegated to things like moderating panels, right? So you get a Jewish person, a Christian, and a Muslim together, and then I get to moderate the panel. That's not cool, actually. I have a religious perspective as well. I should be on the panel. They can find someone else to moderate the panel. We're not just a clearinghouse for other people's perspectives. We have our own perspective, and we have a right to express that perspective just the same as everybody else. So that's what I mean by giving voice. And I've talked already about inclusive language. And then I've said we maintain our right to critique. What I mean by that is we should never give up our right to openly and robustly criticize dangerous religious practices and beliefs. We don't actually have to make people comfortable by our presence in these spaces. A lot of people around the table at these interfaith spaces believe in things that I think are evil, false, or otherwise wrong, right? And they can deal with the fact that I believe some things that they think are evil, false, and wrong, right? I shouldn't be the one who's always put out by their beliefs. They can sometimes be put out by my beliefs. And so just like they can say things that would effectively be a criticism of my perspective, I'm allowed to say things that can be a criticism of their perspective. And as long as you take up the space forcefully, I've never found a problem with that. I've never attended an interfaith event in which I've not been able to articulate to my satisfaction any criticism I have of a particular religious practice or religious belief. So those are my three rules, as it were, my three commandments of interfaith engagement. Values first, don't do anything that compromises our ethical humanist values. Make sure we have equal representation in language and in opportunity to present our perspective, and maintain your right to critique. Don't think you have to sit there not disagreeing with anything that people say. And if we do this, I think there are countless benefits of our participation in interfaith spaces. And this gets to addressing your question, Amy, about why would we want to do this? Why would we want our logo on a page with religious symbols? I think there are lots of reasons. Firstly, because there are tons of people out there who are seeking communities like ours who don't know we exist and who are thankful for an expression of a point of view that matches their own. I have never done an interfaith event where I've spoken where multiple people haven't come up to me afterwards to thank me for being an openly non-theistic voice in the space. People are hungry for leadership that doesn't come from a traditional religious perspective, and we can provide it, but only if we show up. If we don't show up, we cede these spaces of moral discussion to traditional religions, and then they'll pass their stupid statement that doesn't say anything about gay people because no one was there to tell them not to. I think that's the second reason. We actually often have a better, more informed perspective on a lot of these moral issues than the traditional religions do. We don't have their hang-ups. We don't have their scriptural concerns. We don't have their authoritarian structures. So we can push for more progressive, more humane perspectives to be promoted than otherwise would be promoted. And finally, it's part of being members of a multi-faith community in a multi-faith world. We live in a country in which people who are explicitly humanists are a tiny minority. And so we have to work alongside people who don't share our religious perspective in order to get anything done. And interfaith work, I think, can be a really effective way to do that. So I'm going to leave the remaining 15 to 20 minutes for questions and discussion from people about what I've shared. And then I'm happy to, take any questions, thoughts, feelings.
James, you want to go back to Amy's question first?
Well, I think I tried to give a bit of an answer to that question, but Amy, if you think if you'd like to say something, if you think there's more to be said, then go ahead. Tell me I'm wrong.
James, Joe Schumann has a comment, but he's not sure how to get you to recognize him. He's having some technical issue. I just want to let you know.
Well, Joe, go ahead whenever you like.
Yeah, thanks, James. For some reason, I technically couldn't find the hand raising function on the feature here. Yeah, just a few comments. This is very edifying and certainly in my spirit. For 6 years, I was actually the chairman, humanist and atheist I am, of the TNET Clergy Council. And rather than sound more marvelous than that is, in effect, I was, because nobody else wanted the job, so they were willing to have me chair, right? Sometimes it was chairmanship by default. I just want to make some comments. I've been involved in a lot of interreligious forums and activities myself through the years, and there are some antipodal or oppositional tendencies that I see. One is, and this was true of the TNET Clergy Council, these groups I found generally tend to attract clergy who are on the liberal, more progressive end, simply or self-selective, simply because very conservative clergy will not join. If you have an evangelical who has to witness for Christ, he's not going to feel comfortable in an environment where he can't do that. So there's a type of self-selectivity towards the more liberal or inclusive end of the spectrum. On the other hand, I find that religion is an interesting phenomenon with regards to people's identification and their consciousness. It's one field of human endeavor in which I find some people find it very hard to think out of the box. They have their own religious convictions and beliefs and dogmas, and it becomes difficult for them very often to basically appreciate that other people have positions that are at variance. And I agree with you. I think we can play an important role in terms of trying to broaden the consciousness of people who are traditionally religious to show that there are other perspectives, including ours, and ours can have a bona fide moral, we have moral substance and character and so on and so forth, which I think is a very winning position. The last point that comes out of two other points that come out of my experience is that, and you sort of hinted at this, is that because I find many clergy are very turf specific, they're very fearful of engaging in interfaith work, they're very fearful of ranging very far outside of their communities. We, I think, have more latitude in that regard. So we have more opportunities for social action, social justice work in the generic community than many religious folks do, because they're wedded to their congregations and are fearful of moving beyond. So we actually have some scope there. And I cannot remember the last point I want to make, but that's sufficient. Okay, just a few observations of the complexity, variety of religious styles, and how we can fit in. Okay, thanks.
You're definitely right that in general, interfaith work does tend to draw more liberal religious adherents than more evangelical conservative ones. That said, I have to say, in St. Louis, with the interfaith partnership that I've worked on for a long time, because of the incredibly powerful Catholic presence in the city, the archdiocese plays a major role, and they get a lot of sway in what is said and what is done in that community. And obviously there are some issues in which Roman Catholicism is quite liberal, and then some issues where it's definitely not, and that's an interesting dynamic.
Well, I just want to say one thing. It can work to our advantage in some cases. I represented the AU for many years on the National Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and the Catholic Church has a very good position on capital punishment, and it was marvelous. Here we were, 20 people around the table. I represented 3,000. The Catholic representative represented 60 million people, and we each had an equal vote on the coalition board. So it was a way of, coalitions are good for us because they expand our very minimal empowerment and broaden it in a way. So I've always argued in favor of coalition work, and including religious coalitions. Right, yeah.
Yes, I think that many people who don't necessarily know what this interfaith work involves don't necessarily understand how politically significant many faith groups are in particular areas, and that allying with them on areas of shared concern can be a way of amplifying our political influence. So that's definitely the case. For instance, the first thing I did post-COVID in person was a press conference with the Archdiocese of St. Louis against a ludicrous law they want to pass in Missouri to allow people to bring concealed firearms specifically into churches. And the fact that the Archdiocese was against that amplified our voice enormously, because they're much, much more powerful. So that might be another answer to Amy's question, is that sometimes we can piggyback. Okay, Paula, go ahead.
So we here in Silicon Valley don't have a clergy leader. So while I have participated just a tiny bit in some interfaith work, because I'm not certified clergy, I have no real voice. I'm more like an observer and ask for comments. So that's just one thing about some of us in leaderless societies. Another thing I want to mention is the Parliament of World Religions. And that is, I've attended a couple of their world religions, and this document Which the original one was in 1993, and then they wrote it, added to it in 1999, does not mention God or divine or texts anywhere. It is a document of values. And it's just an amazing interfaith organization, I think. I wonder, James, do you have an opinion? Are you familiar with the Parliament?
I've just put a link to the website, the Parliament of World Religions, in the chat so people can look it up. I know that some of our leaders have been involved in it. I think Anne Clayson, for instance, has been involved. I've tried to get involved and found them incredibly resistant. So I've had a very negative experience, but I know that that hasn't been the experience of all our leaders before. I found that different interfaith organizations are differently open to non-theistic groups like ours participating, and this one is a nut I haven't been able to crack. So I haven't done anything with them because I've never got them to allow me to participate in anything. But I want to address your first part of the comment, and then also to pick up some of the things in the chat, because there's an interesting discussion happening in the chat. I think that whenever a member of an ethical society is present at an interfaith event, they are representing ethical humanism. It doesn't matter whether you're the leader or not, whether you have a leader. Everything that I've spoken about today was not designed for professional leaders in mind. It was designed for individual members participating in interfaith work, because you are then the representative of your community. You're not formally the representative of the community, but you are de facto the representative of your community. And you still need to figure out how you're going to represent that community when you're one of likely the only people present from ethical humanism there. And so this wasn't designed, when I first gave this workshop, it was actually for a non-ethical humanist audience that didn't have any, it wasn't even a congregational movement. It was just people who wanted to themselves individually participate. So I would say go out there. And I think the main thing that I'm encouraging people to do is, firstly, do get involved in these spaces. They're often very powerful ways to be involved in our communities. But secondly, don't be afraid to be assertive about our own beliefs and values. And one of the things that's really interesting to me in the responses to which I thought would happen in the responses to the polls, is that people are too willing to go along for the sake of going along and think that our beliefs and values are not important. Our beliefs and values are just as important as the Christian person there and the Muslim person there. There's nothing secondary. We don't have to compromise our beliefs for the sake of other people. That's my main kind of thing I want to push in there. Does that answer your question? Okay, so there's a lot of questions in the chat about what does it mean to say that we have faith or not have faith, and if we didn't want to say that we have faith, which is different from being a religion, then would we want to get involved in interfaith work? So I'm going to be super direct. I don't use the word faith. I don't like it. It doesn't describe how I think about my beliefs. I don't think I have a faith in anything, and I don't consider myself a person of faith. I still do interfaith work because I think the work is more important than the word used to describe it, at least in terms of getting in the door. Once I'm there, I'm going to advocate for more inclusive language. And at some point, maybe I'll get the St. Louis Interfaith Council or whatever it's called to change its name, right? I would like that. I think it would be better to have a more inclusive name. And to give you an example, I mean, we looked at a couple of statements they put out, and some people noted that the second statement I showed you talked about people, I can't remember exactly what it said. Let me find it. A community of many faiths and none, it says at the end. That's because I was there. That's because I've been there for years telling them to use that language, right? So eventually you make that change, but you only make it by actually being a participant in the process, right? You can't expect people to be more inclusive to you when you don't even bother to show up, right? So you have to show up first. You kind of have to swallow your concerns about the language, and you have to be assertive and say, hey, we're part of this community too. We have a unique religious perspective. It's just as valuable as yours, and we want to be involved. And so and I found that people are usually pretty open to it. Sometimes they're not. And, you know, you have to just keep going and being annoying. I want to tell you a story actually about that to end the workshop, because I think it was one of the clearest examples of this work, just the presence of humanists in interfaith spaces making a difference about how issues are discussed. And I'm going to bring up my notes because I can't remember the exact story and when it happened. But essentially, I was at an interfaith conference, and this was some years before I joined the ethical movement. So I was just there as a random humanist. And it was basically an opportunity of people of different religions to come together to explore the challenges of the world. And the keynote presentation was a presentation on the art of dialogue by a rabbi called Rabbi Moshe Waldoks, who is a very, very famous rabbi, internationally famous, big pals with the Dalai Lama, seriously religious dude. And we had some discussions in small panels beforehand, little groups and things like that, about our religious values. And I'd been able to identify myself as a humanist and an atheist and talk about what that meant to me and my beliefs. And during his talk, he had a bit about reaching out with both hands to embrace and improve the world. And he's starting this piece of his talk and he says, God has given you two hands. And then he looks at me in the audience and he stops and then continues, or however you've got them, by evolution, or however, but you've got them, you've got two hands. Now, I'm willing to bet that he never put that bit about evolution in his talk before. I bet he never did. I think it's very likely he always told his story unproblematically, saying that God gave us two hands, assuming that everyone would just go along with it. But there was me, you know, scrappy little atheist at the God party, and he sees that I was there and he's heard me speak about my values and my beliefs, and he felt like he had to acknowledge that there were people in the room who didn't believe in God. And so he name-checked this little theory called evolution in his keynote speech and recognized that there were people there who weren't traditionally religious in that way. And I think that's a win. You know, I think it's a lot better than if I had stayed at home and thought to myself, I'm not participating in this because it's got the word faith in the title. I think my presence there did more for the view of how humanists are seen in the United States than if I had declined my participation and allowed my space to be taken up by a Hindu or a Muslim or another variety of Christian. So that's really one of the reasons why I'm encouraging us to get involved in interfaith spaces assertively. Because when we do so, we can be public advocates for our worldview. And I think that's important in a world where many people are looking for ethical humanism but don't know that we exist. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I don't know how you usually end these things, Anna, but I've run out of things to say. If people want my packet with all the information in it of the different texts and the questions, I can send it out by email as well. And I'm sure that the conference organizers can send it out by email. It looks like there's a question from the person on the phone. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. This is Zabby, and I really enjoyed this presentation. And back to your 3 commandments of interfaith work, I believe that they can be applied internally within the ethical culture society.
How do you think? I hadn't thought of it like that. How do you?
Great.
Well,
the assertiveness to make changes, the ability to criticize, the ability to, and I found hearing many of this is my 11th meeting that I've attended in this convention, and or assembly, and I just find the people very beautiful and giving equal representation to me, and you know, you put I put the values that I bring to ethical culture first, and I have the right to criticize and have, and so I believe that's going to be very important for the growth of ethical culture societies.
Well, I think
The
maybe
union.
maybe we can try and find some way to embed them in our internal practices then.
Yes, that would
Thank
be
you.
great. And I thank you. I'm from the Ethical Culture Society of Suffolk.
Oh,
on Long
wonderful.
Island.
It's lovely to
And
have
you
people from
actually you
Suffolk.
came to our group too.
I remember.
Yes.
It's one of my favorite things, and I can't wait until we can start visiting societies in person again. It looks like we're going back into lockdown in St. Louis probably, so hooray, it's all going in the wrong direction. But someday maybe we can visit in person. But if you can't, the St. Louis Society has Zoom gatherings every Sunday, and everyone is of course very welcome. Many of you on the East Coast who maybe have never attended a platform in St. Louis can come and see how we do it, because we do it a hour after many of you have had your platforms, because we're on Central Time, and so you can join us anytime, and we're happy to make you part of our community for a bit.
Oh.
Anna has posted the feedback form in the chat. Please fill it out. You can tell me how impolite you think I was to Jacob. And I'm a little sick right now, so maybe I wasn't as polite as I should have been. So you can fill that out, and I'd be happy to read that. And I have to take any feedback that you have. How do we close the event, Emily? How do you normally end this?
Say a prayer. No.
Elsa, say a prayer.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
The number of times I've had to explain that it is not inclusive to start everything with a mandatory prayer. Okay, I'll tell you, for those of you who've held on this long, I'll tell you a very short, very funny little story about this. When I just got to St. Louis, I had just started my internship to finish my training as a leader. It was very shortly after Mike Brown had been killed, and I attended a big gathering of clergy of many different religious traditions to try and figure out what the clergy in the city were going to do in terms of anti-racist activism to respond to that murder. And we got into this big church hall, and the main organizer started the meeting formally. And she says, would anybody here object if we started with a prayer? And they asked me, so I put up my hand. I didn't really know any of these people. And she looks around the room at these like maybe 50, 60 people, scanning all the people. She sees me with my hand raised. She does a double take. She like literally physically did a double take, continues scanning the room, and then led everyone in prayer. Now, that was not a great example of how to do interfaith work. If you're going to do it anyway, don't ask the question. But since then, since I and that person marched together, did panels together, shut down streets together, got arrested together, she is much more aware of the language that she uses and the way that she can create a space for all people, regardless of their religious beliefs, in the work that we do together. And that's enabled many more people in my society to be involved in that work because they feel more welcomed by how they approach it. So sometimes you have to get over that initial hurdle and keep going. Okay, that's really the end. I'm going to leave now because I need a big glass of water. Thank you, everybody, and have a very good night.
Good night. Thank you.